Hello everyone, and welcome to this video on how to integrate a sex and/or gender perspective into research content. My name is Mary Lou O'Neill, and I'm the coordinator of the Budget It project and a professor of gender and sociology at Kadir Has University in Istanbul, Turkey. This video is part of a group of training videos produced under the European Union-funded project Budget It. Budget It stands for Building Gender Plus Equality Through Gender Plus Budgeting for Institutional Transformation. Budget It is a 3-year project designed to use gender plus budgeting to transform institutions to advance inclusive gender plus equality and enhance the reputation, inclusiveness, and research excellence of the widening countries of Bosnia, Serbia, and Turkey, assisted by international leading university counterparts in Italy and Spain. To start, what exactly do we mean when we talk about integrating a sex and/or gender perspective into research content? The integration of a sex and/or gender perspective involves systematically considering how differences and inequalities related to sex and gender roles influence various aspects of research, policies, and practices. The idea is to ensure that sex and gender are considered in every aspect of research, regardless of the field or topic. You might now be asking why. Why is this important? Most of human history, male bodies and the male experience has been considered the accepted norm. The male body and experiences that have been used are also ones that are narrowly defined, generally young, white, cisgender, able-bodied, and more often than not class privileged. This proves problematic in part because it completely ignores both women and gender diverse people, but also many different men's experiences. Aside from the lack of equality in such an approach, research that ignores sex and/or gender altogether is incomplete. It ignores one of the most fundamental variables and organizing principles in society. Moreover, such a narrow approach can prove dangerous. Caroline Criado Perez, in the book Invisible Women, Exploring Data Bias in a World Designed for Men, demonstrates the dangers of research that does not integrate sex and gender. Crash dummies used to test for car safety are designed based on the quote-unquote average male body, which is significantly taller and heavier than many women. Current safety regulations do not require the use of crash dummies based on the average female body, and this may be why women are 73% more likely to be injured in head-on collisions. Women are also often misdiagnosed when having a heart attack because their symptoms are viewed as atypical, meaning they are not the typical symptoms that are seen in men. This demonstrates how important it is to consider sex and gender in every area of research and the serious consequences that can arrive when we do not. Another issue to consider is the added value that the integration of a sex or gender perspective can bring to any given area of research. While sex and gender should be an integral part of research content in all fields, this has not usually been the case. Less than 2% of publications in EU countries include a sex or gender perspective, and this is the same for European Union-funded projects. Integrating a sex or gender perspective represents an opportunity to add excellence and innovation to many areas of study. Before I discuss the details of how to integrate a sex and/or gender perspective, it's important that we are clear about the terminology that will be used. Sex refers to the biological and physiological characteristics that define humans as male or female. Gender, on the other hand, refers to the characteristics of women, men, girls, and boys that are socially constructed. This includes norms, behaviors, and roles associated with being a man, woman, girl, or boy, as well as relationships with each other. As a social construct, gender varies from society to society and can change over time. Gender plus is a newer concept that recognizes that gender can take many forms and is expressed in many ways. It also recognizes that there is a wide variety of gendered expression within groups. This is a concept that helps us step outside of the gender binary and recognizes that gender cannot be reduced to just women and men. Intersectionality is a concept that acknowledges that identity is not simply constructed from gender, but rather gender also intersects and is constructed by other social identities such as race, age, sexual orientation, and class, just to name a few. As I just said, intersectionality is a conceptual tool that helps us understand the diversity within gender groups. The illustration provides some of the categories that can be explored when using an intersectional perspective. Now that we have covered the what and the why of integrating a sex and/or gender perspective, where do we actually start? One thing that is important to remember is that if we are going to truly integrate a sex and/or gender perspective into our research, then we need to consider sex and/or gender at every stage of the research, from choosing your topic to the research question, the methodology, data collection, and reporting your findings. Of course, if there is a budget for your research, this is also something to consider, as well as the composition of the research team, if there is one. The goal is to take into consideration sex and/or gender at each step of the research project. What follows is really a set of questions to help us getting started with integrating sex and/or gender in our research. One thing to consider when you are choosing a topic are the research priorities in your field. Who sets the priorities, and does one sex or gender benefit more from those priorities? Who is included or left out? One example might be the case of osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is a bone disease that causes bones to become weak, porous, and fragile, and often thought to almost exclusively affect women. While it is more commonly found in women, osteoporosis also affects 1 in 5 men. However, due to the perception of osteoporosis as a disease affecting only women, men are often overlooked, and research on women is much more common. These are some questions to help us begin to consider sex and gender in our research. Integrating a sex and/or gender perspective in our research requires a certain amount of reflection on the process of research itself. This includes examining the theories and concepts that we employ in our studies. Are there assumptions about sex or gender that are reflected in the theories or concepts in your field? For example, anthropologist Emily Martin, in her article, The Egg and the Sperm, How Science Has Constructed a Romance based on stereotypical male-female roles, demonstrates how the language used in many mainstream biology textbooks to discuss reproduction replicates common gender role assumptions. Sperm are described as active and having a mission. They have embarked on a perilous mission, if you will. All this takes place while the egg waits for the sperm to rescue it and to provide meaning to its existence through fertilization. The point here is that the language of activity and passivity mirrors the ways that many cultures have historically portrayed men and women, showing how even science, in this case biology, is not exempt from gender. As with all research, one of the central pieces is the research question. Here is no different. We're just ensuring that we add sex or gender or both to the creation of the research question. As always, it's important to start with a literature review to determine what has or has not been done regarding sex or gender in the field. As you may recall, I mentioned that less than 2% of publications in EU countries in recent years include a sex or gender perspective. So there is a good chance that you may not find anything, but still don't skip this step. The remaining questions about assumptions regarding gender and who is included or left out can also help craft a solid research question that ensures the integration of sex and/or gender. This next section, we are going to look more closely at the details of how to integrate sex into a research topic. We will then explore how to integrate gender. Although sex and gender nearly always coexist, for our purposes here, we will examine them separately. Once you have completed your literature review, it's important to determine what kind of variable gender is. In this case, what kind of variable sex is in terms of your study. Is it covariate, confounder, or explanatory? After this, you will need to determine which sex characteristics are important and relevant. Will you need to examine genetic, hormonal, physiological, or other characteristics? Of course, you will need to think about how sex also intersects with race, class, disability, or other social identities. These are the steps for outlining the problem that is the subject of your study. Moving on to research design, it is important to be clear about whether sex serves as an explanatory factor, something that exerts an influence, or something that regulates associations or relationships between two or more things. This directly connects to data and what kind of data you plan to collect. In longitudinal studies, for example, it is important to consider the impact of reproduction on study subjects. When it comes to data collection, it is also important to include intersex humans and animals in your studies, as well as to ensure the sample sizes are large enough for females, males, and intersex subjects to ensure reliable results. Given that sex is not the only social identity that humans embody, it is also important to consider how other social factors such as age, race, class, sexual orientation, etc. intersect with sex. And of course, the sex of the subject is not the only important factor. We also need to examine how the sex of the researcher may impact the research design and outcomes. For example, if you are working with a single-sex group of individuals, could the sex of the researcher hinder access or even provide access to that group? If your research involves surveys, it is important to distinguish between sex at birth and gender and include separate questions for these two categories. In product and systems design, data collection should pay careful attention to anthropometric, biomechanical, and physiological factors that vary by sex. Moving on to the analysis phase, there are a number of things to consider. It is important to examine overlaps between groups, but also to analyze variations within sex groups. It is vital to not assume that all females and all males are the same or will have the same reaction to a given event. Again, if you do observe sex differences, then consider the source of those differences. Are the differences environmental, genetic, hormonal, etc.? It is also important to analyze the way observed differences are impacted by age, race, socioeconomic status, or other social identities. This is the intersectional perspective. For longitudinal studies, there needs to be consideration of how sex variations may change over time. You have now reached the end of your research which integrates sex, but our work continues in the dissemination phase. How we report the sex of sample subjects or animals is an important part of integrating sex into research. You need to report the sex of your subjects, even if there is only one. You need to report the sex distribution of the cells, animals, or human subjects in your research. Results also need to be disaggregated by sex. And of course, you need to report information on how the data around sex was obtained. Ensure that sex variations are properly shown throughout the research. This includes tables, figures, etc. It is also important to report all results, positive, negative, or inconclusive. This also includes findings of no differences between sexes. If there are differences to be reported, it is vital to not overemphasize them. At the same time, it's important to not underemphasize them either. The important question is, are the differences meaningful? Finally, you can consider using the Sex and Gender Equity in Research, or SAGER guidelines. The SAGER guidelines are a comprehensive procedure for reporting on sex and gender information in study design, data analysis, results, and interpretation of findings. You can find a link to them in the bibliography provided at the end of the slides. The steps for integrating gender are largely the same as those for integrating sex. So rather than covering each step as I did before, I will highlight the steps that are different. As always, we start with a literature review to gain an understanding of where the field is concerning the integration and understanding of gender. It is important here that we as researchers also examine our own understanding and assumptions about gender to ensure that these do not unnecessarily influence our research. When focusing on gender, we need to include a wide range of gender identities and ensure that our research subjects have the opportunity to identify themselves in terms of gender. It is also important to ensure that a wide range of individuals have access to your research. This may require some creative thinking about how to reach certain groups and recruit them to your study. In order to ensure that a wide variety of gender identities are included in our research, we may also need to oversample certain groups. We still need to also consider intersectionality and the ways that other social identities interact with gender. In the research design phase, it is vital to examine the risks of either stereotyping certain groups or excluding them in terms of how we design our studies. This returns us to the importance of examining our own assumptions about both gender but also other social identities. When we move to analysis, if you are using existing data, it needs to be analyzed for any gender biases that may be present in the data. Such biases both skew results but also perpetuate gender bias in general. Given the socially constructed nature of gender, we also need to consider how gender norms, identities, and relations intersect to shape people's experiences, opportunities, and practices. For dissemination, the steps are the same as those for sex. Remember to report all your results by both sex and gender, and include how you obtain that information, and ensure that you do not over or underemphasize any similarities or differences that you do find. I think it is important to say at this point that when we integrate sex and/or gender, we may not find any differences, which is fine, but the goal is to show that there are no differences in a rigorous and scientific manner, rather than to simply assume that that is the case. Up to this point, we have discussed sex and gender separately, but more often than not, they interact and are mutually constitutive. If possible, it is important to examine sex and gender and how they work together. Pain is a good example for this, given that it has biological aspects in that the experience of pain is different for males and females, but also has gendered aspects. For example, how individuals, women, men, and gender diverse peoples report pain, gender impacts also how doctors treat pain, and the gender of the physician may also influence how individuals experience pain levels. Sex and gender also interact in the case of design and built environments. We need to consider how both physical needs, this is the sex part, and social needs, this is the gender aspect, work together in individuals in order to create effective and equitable design. This also includes ensuring that design does not exclude one group or another, or use a single group, usually males or men, as a proxy for all groups, which has historically been the case. As a way to summarize all that has been talked about, we have provided a checklist, which is also available as a download on the Budget It project website. A link will be provided in the comments. The checklist is a list of questions to prompt you and remind you of the different aspects of including sex and/or gender in your research. When integrating a sex and/or gender perspective in your research, it is essential to consider sex or gender at each and every step in the research process, from the research question through the composition of your research team, to dissemination, and the reporting of your findings. The checklist begins with considerations of the composition of your research team. Is there a gender balance in your team? Do they have the required knowledge about sex and/or gender that is necessary for the research? And have you considered issues of gender equality, such as equal opportunities for all and work-life balance, in how you conceive the research process? The list moves on to research design with questions reminding us to ensure that the research proposal explicitly and comprehensively explains how gender issues will be handled, and if sex and gender issues will not be included, is there a statement explaining why not? There is also a question that reminds us that our research may have impact on women and men, and that we should consider that and how to handle such impacts. We then move on to methodology, where the questions emphasize the fit between methodology and sex and gender. Does the chosen methodology actually explore sex and/or gender, as well as other social identities that influence sex and gender? Will it yield the results that we are looking for? And have you considered any gendered assumptions that may exist in the chosen methodology? Lastly, we come to reporting any findings. It is important to remember to present all research findings, positive, negative, or otherwise, and they should be presented disaggregated by sex and/or gender. Of course, it is also important to ensure that the language used in our publications, as well as any images or representations of women, men, or gender diverse people, are free of stereotypes and sexism and accurately represent the findings of the research. Again, I just want to emphasize once again that research that integrates a sex or gender perspective may not find any substantial differences or similarities for that matter. But the essential aspect of this is to demonstrate the lack of differences or the existence of differences with rigorous scientific research rather than to simply assume it. We hope this video has given you some ideas and help about how to integrate a sex and/or gender perspective in your research. And if you would like to explore this topic in more detail, you can visit the GenderX online module, which will guide you through many of the steps presented here. You can also visit the Gendered Innovations website. Both of these resources were adapted for this video, and links are available in the comment section. I've also provided some references that were used to develop this video. Thanks for watching, and I hope it was helpful for you as you try to integrate a sex and/or gender perspective in your research. You can find more resources about gender equality planning and gender budgeting on the Budget It website.